For years, the penguin has searched far and wide, trying to discover enlightenment, but for years none could be found. Until recently, it appears that our penguin has reached the pinnacle of its success using an online graphing calculator. And hold up, is that a blue banana? So yeah, my free time decided to open the window and leap out into the void.
Oh my god! Oh jeez! Oh my god! Oh jeez!
But anyway, in this video, I'll try and show you how I was able to make this picture, and maybe you can too. Well anyways, let's hop into the video. So I've tried to organize this process of making pictures on a graphing calculator into 5 relatively easy to follow steps, and my first one is inspiration. Your inspiration can be anything. It can be really general or simple or perhaps very detailed and specific. Let's say you want the basics to practice and want to make a generic smiley face, or you want to use my fruit bowl as inspiration. That's fine too, as long as you take what you learned to do something new. I mean, it's not like the idea of a fruit bowl as an idea for art is exactly original. By golly, you can momentarily put the Mona Lisa in the background of Desmos. If you don't know how to do it, you can do it like this. And now just put lines and circles on top of the frame. Later, you could just remove your example picture. Ta-da! Now, once you've got your inspiration and loaded up Desmos, maybe even pasted an image in the back, it probably hit you. The only graphs I know how to do are a point and a line. And if you're not sure how to graph a point or a line yet, then... Well anyway, I'll show you some graphs I would recommend using in your pictures. Keep in mind that I'll go over graph transformations later, which for those of you who don't know what a graph transformation is, it transforms a graph. The graphs are a line. So I'm going to start simple, but before everything fancy comes along, we have the line, which is pretty simple compared to the upcoming stuff. For a vertical line, we set x equal to the x-intercept, and the same with y and a horizontal line. In graphing a line with a slope that is not 0, I would highly recommend using point-slope formula for your line, because it is the easiest for graphing. All you need is a point of intersection and the slope, compared to maybe slope-intercept form, which needs the y-intercept, which may be complicated to get, depending on your line. Next is the parabola. For all equations with an x and a y, keep in mind that they are variables and do not change x and y with numbers. Next is the fat parabola. In case you want the curve of the parabola but a bit more, cornered, you can also keep going by intervals of even numbers, such as 6, 8, etc. The higher the number, the more corner-like the graph looks. Next is the circle. Again, I'll go over graph transformations later, so for now ignore the h and the k, just like the parabola and the fat parabola, but just know that the r in this equation is the length of the radius. Next is the ellipse. Now, a circle is pretty much an ellipse, except both the major and minor axes are the same. Here, I just listed the ellipse in case you want some variety in your, curvy shapes. With my grapes, I used a combination of circles and ellipses. With an ellipse, you can ignore the h and k for now, but know that the A is the length of the major axis, and B is the length of the minor axis. I'll talk about them a bit later. This is a nice shape to know, but you may not use it very often. It's more of one of those nice-to-haves. I'll talk about the letters later when I mention graph transformations. Now we're getting into some of the polar curves, which are different from Cartesian graphs because they're on the polar coordinate system, so I'm putting these graphs in step 2b, polar curves. Well, our first polar curve is the rose curve. Well anyway, from now on, these polar curves will be using r and theta instead of x and y. I will be talking about how to change your shape later. Fun fact, the cardioid specifically was called that because it looks like a heart, and terms like cardio or the cardiovascular system relate to the heart. If you're doing cardio exercise, you are exercising your heart, and your cardiovascular system includes the heart. Cool, huh? These next couple of graphs will follow the same general equation, but what differentiates the graph will have to do with A and B. A graph will only be a cardioid if A equals B. And here are some basic transforming facts if you care. Large chunk of the graph will be on the top if your sign is positive, and on the bottom if your sign is negative. The graph will reach a maximum or minimum at the sum of a and b, and the graph will go in a bit and always touch the origin, or 0, theta. You can also make this more horizontal instead of vertical if you exchange sine of theta for cosine of theta. Next is the inner loop lemmason. This graph requires a to be less than b, and the basic transformations are the exact same as the cardioid, with the added bonus that the local maximum or minimum of the inner loop of our inner loop lemmason will be b minus a. Next is the dimpled lemmason because it has a little dimple. Almost done with this, even I think it's boring, spitball of graphs, as this is the second to last one. Also, I kid you not that this is the name of this graph. This graph requires a to be greater than b, and the basic transformations are you guessed it, the same as the cardioid and the inner loop lemmason. But with a few exceptions, the local maximum will still be the sum of a and b, but this time the graph will go in a bit at a minus b, but on the other side of the x or y axis, depending on whether you chose sine or cosine. If you could somehow integrate this into your picture, that would be a spectacle. I think an ellipse that's had its domain changed is sufficient, but if you want some style points in your picture, then be my guest. And that's it. I didn't include some other graphs such as the square root, cubic, and hyperbola graphs because of the parabola or some transformation and/or domain range and/or inverse magic would do the trick. Now on to step 3. Now you may be getting tired of me saying graph transformations, and I'll get to them later because I am too. So here they are, graph transformations. Ta-da! So I've tried my best to organize some letter variables corresponding to their same meaning in the graph, so it is easier to understand, like H and K or whatever those arbitrary letters may mean. So first up we have H and K. And I have no idea why these letters were chosen. I wasn't at their conference when they decided this. Anyway, what H and K do is that they adjust where the center of the graph, or in the case of the parabola, the vertex. For example, if H were 1 and K were 2, then the centers of our circle or ellipse would be at 1, 2, or the vertex of our parabola would be at 1, 2. Crazy, right? This can also be known as horizontal and vertical shift, which leads us into our next two letters, C and D. I could have saved time and just swapped the generic C and D for H and K, but it wouldn't really make sense because the sign graph doesn't really have a vertex or center. So I stuck with the usual letters for shifting C and D. Basically, if you want the graph to go right, then increase C from 0, and to shift to the left, decrease C from 0. However, keep in mind that the graph infinitely repeats the same pattern every 2 pi. D works the same as C, except it shifts the graph up and down. And while we're on the topic of transforming sign, let's talk about the two other letters, A and B. A in this case refers to vertical stretch, and when A equals 1, our graph is the parent function, as long as the graph has not been transformed yet. By parent function, I mean the original, non-transformed function. When A is greater than 1, our graph gets taller and by nature skinnier. When A is less than 1, but also greater than 0, our graph will get shorter and by nature fatter. You can play around with this a bit to get the shape you desire. With our parabola graph, the exact same logic applies. Also, whenever A is negative, we just reflect the parabola along the y level of the vertex. If A refers to vertical stretch, this may come as a surprise to you, but B actually refers to horizontal stretch. While it can be used with a parabola, if you understand how A works, it is useless if you only want to transform your graph. B is more used when transforming the sign graph. When B equals 1, our graph is the same, and when B is greater than 1, the graph pretty much gets squeezed inward. Same with B is less than 1, as the graph gets pulled outward, kind of. You don't need to worry about making B negative, as playing with C would do the trick for you. Now, we already talked about some transformations of an ellipse, H and K, and I also know that I'm already repeating letters, something that'll probably confuse you, but it is the convention to have these letters as A and B. So I just made the letters capital to try and lessen your confusion. But let's be honest, if you're watching this video and haven't learned about graph transformations or polar curves yet, you're probably beyond confusion anyway. Well anyway, A is for major axis and B is for minor axis. The reason I have two equations and graphs listed is because an ellipse can have either a vertical major axis or a horizontal major axis. The major axis is the distance from the center of the ellipse to the vertex, or the place furthest from the center. As you might expect, if A is the major axis and the longer distance, then B is the minor axis and the shorter distance from the center, to a place called the co-vertex. So pretty much A will always be bigger than B, and whatever variable A is under will determine the major axis. For example, if A is under X, then we will have a horizontal major axis, and if A is under Y, we will have a vertical major axis. You can also increase or decrease A and B to shape the graph. R is probably the simplest variable to work with out of all the ones I have said so far. In fact, I'm surprised this wasn't the first variable I said. Actually, I'm not. As someone who teaches math, of course I need to put everything in a confusing order to create as much chaos as possible. But yeah, R in this case actually has a reason for being R, and that's because it stands for radius, as in the radius of the circle. Increase R to make the circle bigger, decrease R to make the circle smaller. It's as simple as that. Now we are done with the transformations of Cartesian graphs, and on to, let's say, step 3b, transformations of polar curves. Now we're on the polar curves and are starting with one of my favorites, the rose curve. Bet you'll never guess where they thought of that name. Although personally I think maybe Daisy could have been a better fit. But I digress. Similar to H and K from before, in a rose curve, N has to do with transforming the graph, but this time it changes the graph quite a bit. It follows a nice pattern. For all integers not including 0, -1, or 1, if the number is odd, the rose curve will have that many petals. If the number is even, then the rose curve will have twice that many petals. Remember, negative numbers can be even or odd. You can also reflect the graph across the x-axis by swapping the sign of n. Remember, because we are now in the polar coordinate system, we will use r and theta instead of x and y, so we will not change r and theta. Whoa, things got complicated real quick. Not only do these two letters apply to all three of the graphs, which I guess may simplify things a bit actually, but that's off topic. It's actually the third time I'm using the same letters again. Wow, the nerve I have to do that. Well anyway, I know I kind of already told you how A and B work to make each of the different shapes. I guess to transform them more, keeping true to either A is less than, greater than, or equal to B, we can increase A and or B to make the graph look how we want it to. Note that we don't need A and B to increase proportionately, and we can also achieve rotations by playing with sine and cosine and the plus and minus. You'll be happy to know that the convention for C is actually n, so r equals n times sine of theta, but I held back this time to, not explode your brain, although I do have some hunches it might be a bit too late for that. Well anyway, regarding C, the only thing you should really note is that the higher it goes, the larger the spiral becomes. Now hopefully you know how to move around the Cartesian graphs by transformation, but you may have realized I didn't talk about transforming the polar curves, and that is because they aren't as simple as conjuring up an H and a K. To transform polar curves we need to use parametrics. To move the polar curves we would need to input into Desmos f of t times cosine of t plus or minus a, comma, f of t times sine of t plus or minus b, with f of theta being our original polar equation, t being a variable that we can put a restriction on, and a and b being our shift. Wow, what a sentence. I feel absolutely thrilled after saying that. So I guess it's best to work with an example on this one. I'm also confused after that. Let's say we want to move our rose curve r equals 2 sine of 3 theta right 2 and down 4. We would input 2 times sine of 3 theta times cosine of t plus 2, comma, 2 times sine of 3 theta times sine of t minus 4. The plus 2 is to move the graph right 2, and it is next to the cosine because of how cosine relates to x. Similarly, we have -4 to move the graph down 4, and it is next to sine because of how sine relates to y. Oh, and did I mention you're plotting this kind of like a point, so you need parentheses on either side. And that's it for moving shapes around and molding our graphs. Now we have a, dare I say, infinite amount of unique shapes we can graph. Now it's time to make sure they don't overlap. Now that we have our general shape, we can restrict x and maybe y if we want to sort of cut off our graph at some place. We can start with the Cartesian graphs, and how we would cut off our graph is by making an inequality. Because x and y are our variables, we can restrict either x or y. If we want to do both at the same time, That's a bit different and I'll mention it later. Now, it's a bit intuitive how I can restrict either x or y with inequalities, but we would need to use brackets to attach a minimum and or maximum to our x to restrict the possible inputs or domain. And yep, you guessed it, we can do the same to y to restrict the possible outputs or range. Little side comment, but when you put the first bracket when making the inequality, the closing bracket appears automatically, so you don't need to type it again. I don't know if that'll apply to you or not. But Penguin, that's so efficient and bad. I mean, if I want to restrict both domain and range, you mean I have to put in 2 sets of brackets? Isn't there a better and more efficient way to do this so I can save those 5 seconds of my life typing that? As someone who teaches math, I'm so glad you asked. If we find 2 points that we want on the ends of our shape, by finding the point slope formula of this cutoff line, we can input into the brackets an inequality version of this. If you're not sure which inequality sign to choose, pick a point that's not on the graph where you know what side of the inequality it will land on, such as maybe the origin, and test what inequality sign is needed to make it true. Next, if the graph is on the same side of the point as where you want to cut off your shape, use the inequality to make it true. If not, use the inequality to make it false. As I have with steps 2 and 3, I decided to also have a step 4b about placing restrictions upon theta and occasionally r. Unlike how step 4, shall I say, 4a, dealt with restricting both x and y, with the cardioid inner loop lemison and dimpled lemison, we will restrict r and theta. If you do decide to restrict r, remember that r stands for the radius, and it implies cutting off everything outside or inside your radius's circle. With theta, we generally use radians when restricting theta, and if you've never heard of them and only ever heard of degrees, time for some shameless self-promotion, and you can hit that box in the top right corner to learn more about them. Well, I think we all cringed a bit after that, because one full rotation is also known as 2 pi. With the knowledge that these curves start at 0, we can use this handy thing right here to put in our start and stop point. We also need to remember that with our equation, the curves will move counterclockwise. Keeping this in mind, we can find an estimated start and stop point of each curve in terms of theta. Let's say we found 2 angles to start and stop, let's say pi over 2 and 4 pi over 3. We would simply put them in on either side of theta. But what if we want only a bit of the beginning of the graph and a bit of the ending? Because the first angle needs to be smaller than the second angle, and keeping in mind that one full rotation is 2 pi, if we wanted the smaller curve between pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6, we would have 11 pi over 6 on the left and 2 pi plus pi over 6 on the right, or 13 pi over 6. It might be helpful to also note that if we transformed our curve, the same thing works, except instead of restricting theta, we would restrict t. Restricting the rose curve is a bit more complicated, and that's why I'm talking about it second. Because if I said it first, you would have clicked off the video in frustration, if you haven't already. But if I said it second, you would have already fallen asleep from the cardioids and stuff, and you would keep watching. At least, YouTube would think you still are. That's obviously a win-win if you ask me. But there are some things with a rose curve that are the same as the previous curves, like the fact that one rotation is 2 pi, and it starts at 0, and that's where the list of similar things ends. It's also important to know that the graph starts at 0, but then doesn't go counterclockwise like other curves, but kind of spins around. You can kind of guess which petal will be made next by loosely following the curve, and if you ever want to keep some petals, just find where it starts and stops. Note that you may need to input the same graph multiple times with different restrictions if you want only some petals, and if you wanted, I don't know, bunny ears, you can place a greater than restriction upon a number for r. Here I have saved easily the hardest polar curve to restrict, the spiral. You know what, even with all my past math knowledge, even I'm not capable of properly explaining to you how to restrict the spiral, as it's so out of control. One might even say. Let's just change the subject quickly. Oops. Okay, we have all our graphs and stuff in place, but it could use with some aesthetic changes. How do we do that? I'm so glad you asked, but did you know on Desmos for each graph you can change your graph's color, thickness, and opacity? Also line type, but no one really cares about that. For those of you who don't know, opacity is how see-through or transparent the graph gets. This last one is also pretty useful. And you can use inequalities instead of equal signs to color in the middle of your graph. Also, a new section appears where we can change the fill order from like 0.1 to 0.4 to maybe even 1. And yeah, I guess that's about it for this video. I know I didn't exactly show a new mind-breaking concept or even introduce new ideas, but I figured, hey, if you have too much free time, here's a good way to get rid of it. And you never know, one day a good idea for a picture might just hit you. Hey, what's that sound? Chest? Idea. Add a subsection, so instead of like step 2b polar curves, do step 2b.i and 2b.ii for each graph. You can be more organized. Wait, I could have been more organized?